Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Ashira Ostrow. I am a professor of real estate and land use at the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University. And I'm also the executive dean of the the executive director of the Wilbur F. Breslin Center for Real Estate Studies at Hofstra Law School. And I'm really excited to welcome you to our, this year is Hofstra Law School's 50th anniversary, and this is a 50th anniversary program on exploring kind of the future of race in real estate, and with some focus on Long Island. Again, our program today is really focused on the causes and the consequences of residential segregation in the United States. So I'm going to share a couple of slides just to, kind of really illustrate what we mean when we talk about residential segregation. What does that look like? So we do not have to look very far to find pretty blatant and kind of dramatic examples of residential segregations. In fact, we can look at our very own backyard. So this slide indicates or kind of illustrates the racial segregation that exists between Hempstead, where Hofstra University is located, where if you're at school, you're sitting right now, and Garden City, which is literally the next neighborhood over. It's the next village over. And you can see from the slide, Garden City is very light pink. It has a total of 7.3% non-whites, right? That means that, over 90% is white. And then you contrast that with Hempstead, right, which is the dark purple, and Hempstead is 97% non-white. And we're talking about crossing a street, right, and getting from one neighborhood to another. And, racial segregation, any kind of residential segregation, impacts or correlates to, many other inequalities. So you can also see the difference in household income. So again, Garden City, right, is dark blue. It's at the highest level of income, average income in the country, right? Whereas Hempstead, again, right next door, has an average, the red areas in particular have an average of 25,000 annual income, and that's toward the lower end, definitely within the lowest 25% or quartile of society. So there are significant consequences and correlations, negative correlations between residential segregation. And in particular, over the last year, these inequalities have been kind of vividly thrust into public awareness and made very, very clear based on the impact that COVID-19 has had on communities of color. This is just it's an old slide. It's actually from early on in the pandemic, and I think we'll get some updated information on this throughout the program. But even early on, it was very, very clear that COVID-19 was having a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and specifically on Black counties, communities where there was a majority of Black residents. The disproportionately Black counties experiencing 6 times the number of cases per capita than majority white counties. And there's a number of factors that, kind of people who are studying this and have listed to try to explain this disparate impact. But they're all things that you would think about and know about if I asked you to describe the difference between Hempstead and Garden City. These are all things that you might even come up with on your own. So inequitable living conditions, right? The quality of housing, the availability of housing, work circumstances, where are you working? Do you have the luxury of sitting at your home and working at your computer for a year? Or do you have to go out and work in the grocery store or drive a bus or do, different types of work where where we call you an essential worker, but really what that means is you need to put yourself at risk to benefit those of us that are staying at home. And so those areas, there's also a lot of data and statistics on underlying health conditions that affect communities of color and lower access to healthcare, right? And so the bottom line is where you live matters. I teach a course in state and local government law, and a lot of the focus is on boundaries, right? The way that we draw lines between communities matter. It makes a tremendous difference to your life prospects. District boundaries determine what schools you're going to go to. Are you going to go to public school in Garden City? Or are you going to go to public school in Hempstead? Well, that's a big difference in terms of what opportunities are going to be there for you when you graduate. What types of learning materials and resources that you have in the classroom. And again, that again, will impact, many conditions of your life, and also the physical condition of your neighborhood. How often is your garbage picked up, right? How well are your streets maintained? What is the nature of the relationship between the community and the police, right? All of those things vary based on the racial composition of a particular community, or they can vary. So how did we get here? Right. And more importantly, in our next 50 years, what can we do about it? So I'll start us off with a bit of an overview of how we got here. And then each of our panelists, who are just tremendous experts in their areas, will focus on an area of particular concern. So public health, housing discriminations, evictions, and other areas where we know we need to do some work. So the first thing to note is that the high level of residential segregation that characterizes the United States did not happen on its own. It is the kind of accumulation of, years and years of government programs that encouraged and often mandated segregated housing. And so I want to talk specifically about 4 strategies or 4 government policies that really directly segregated communities. And so I want to talk about public housing, right? That's housing that's funded by the government. Also programs where the federal government insured mortgages for private homeowners, racial zoning, and racially restrictive covenants. And I also want to point out and recommend, I know that our first year law students were required or highly recommended that you read The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. And if you want kind of a detailed and very well documented overview of this area, I highly recommend that you read this and kind of think about all the different legal mechanisms. There's many more that I'm going to talk about today, but all of those mechanisms that systematically created our segregated living patterns. So one of the first themes that Richard Rothstein emphasizes is the role of public housing, right? That the way that the government funded and constructed public housing deliberately segregated communities. So public housing began on a large scale during the 1930s. It was part of FDR's New Deal programs to stimulate the economy. And public housing is administered by federal, state, and local agencies. So every level of government is involved in this. The National Housing Act of 1934 authorized the federal government to build public housing, And it also created the Federal Housing Administration, which was authorized to administer the programs. And then in 1937, Congress kind of extended the authority to authorizing loans to local public housing agencies. So state and local governments got involved in constructing public housing and making decisions about where they would be located and who would be qualified to live there. And federal housing policies required, right, that public housing be segregated by race. So the government would build white housing in white neighborhoods and Black housing in Black neighborhoods, and in some cases, intentionally demolish existing integrated neighborhoods and replace them with segregated housing projects. And in addition to public housing, all right, and so this is just kind of what people think about when they think about the projects. The towers of poverty, they're called, and this is actually a nice picture of them. In real life, they looked more run down. And if you've seen The Wire, the television show The Wire, there's pretty good illustration of life inside the projects in downtown in Baltimore. So the Fair Housing Act, I'm sorry, the FHA is a confusing acronym. The Federal Housing Administration also kind of actively promoted segregation in the private housing market. And they did that by providing mortgage insurance to help white buyers purchase homes in the suburbs, right? So in guaranteeing private mortgages and providing mortgage insurance, the federal government was basically assuming the risk that if the buyer defaults, they're going to have to pay for it, right? So they're assuming the risk of buyer default. And as a result of that, they were only willing to guarantee mortgages in areas that had a low risk of default. And they decided which areas had a higher risk of default based explicitly on racial considerations. So the FHA underwriting manual explicitly required the valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, right? To the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups, right? And why are we worried about invasion? Because if there's a change in social or racial occupancy, it will lead to instability and a reduction in values, right? And not only that, the FHA required homeowners and local governments to take proactive measures to prevent integration, right? And we'll go over those in a minute, but the protection offered against adverse change should be found adequate before a high rating is given to this feature, once, et cetera, right? So there are specific recommendations that the manual is going to make to prevent integration and to protect a community from the properties from losing value. And so as part of its program for determining where to guarantee mortgages, the Fair Housing Act created maps, actual maps, and these were called residential security maps, right? So how secure are the values of the residences in these areas? And these maps actually, literally outlined areas with, African-American neighborhoods, which were deemed to be high risk in red ink, right? And that's where we get the term redlining. The idea that a federal agency actually went block by block through the United States and picked out the communities and the areas that had African-American populations and put a red line around them, and then refused to issue loans or to insure bank mortgages to anyone who lived there or who wanted to buy a house there. And the FHA's mortgage program didn't just affect individual home buyers, right? Whether an individual could get a mortgage. It also affected the development of communities because the federal government would only insure loans to real estate developers, right? The ones that were building Levittown in particular, as long as only on the condition that they agree that they will not sell any of the homes to African Americans, right? So we'll give you money to build this, but you need to promise that you're not going to sell any of these to African Americans because that we think will increase the risk of default. And the FHA manual, as I said, sets out several strategies for protecting highly rated neighborhoods from adverse influences. And so, two examples that I want to talk about, well, I guess three, requiring communities to adopt racial zoning ordinances, right, that segregated communities and include racially restrictive covenants in home deeds. These are covenants that prohibit the sale or rental or use of a property by non-whites. And then in some cases, actually requiring developers to physically segregate, neighborhoods, provide a physical separation between neighborhoods. And so just as an example, this is in Detroit in 1941, the Federal Housing Administration required the developer to build a wall, a physical concrete wall, separating his whites-only project from nearby African American residences. So physical separation, right, was a requirement. And earlier, even before the federal government got involved, local governments were really active in promoting segregation and preventing integration. The beginning of zoning in the early part of the 20th century, cities adopted race-based zoning ordinances to formally segregate Black communities. And so this is just an example of a flyer from 1915 in St. Louis. It says, look at these homes now, and there are X's, every house, an entire block ruined by Negro invasion, every house marked X now occupied by Negroes. Save your home, vote for segregation. Right, and so this was distributed in St. Louis in order to encourage voters to adopt a zoning ordinance that would prohibit African Americans from buying properties on blocks that were predominantly white. In 1917, the Supreme Court got involved and actually said, this is, explicitly race-based zoning is unconstitutional. And so, prohibited adopting these expressly racial ordinances. But it didn't stop the practice from happening. And somewhat extraordinarily, more than 30 years after the Supreme Court's ruling, cities were blatantly adopting these types of ordinances. So this is an example from a 1943 zoning ordinance from a city in Texas. And and I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says, an ordinance prescribing that portion of the city within which Negroes and persons of African descent containing as much as 1/8 Negro blood shall reside, except bona fide servants, right, that are living with their families, the families that they're working for, right? It explicitly says Blacks can only live in these specific districts. And which districts are reserved for Blacks? The purple ones, right? These are all industrial. So that guarantees that the residences for Black people are going to be in areas that are, more intensely used. Your house is going to be near a manufacturing facility or, toxic waste sites, and really, really kind of harmful or detrimental land uses. And so this example always shocks me because it's really explicit. And this is after the Supreme Court has declared racial zoning ordinance unconstitutional. But even without express racial language, cities continue to use zoning to segregate neighborhoods. And I would argue till today, zoning is used to maintain segregation. So, in the Lubbock ordinance, districts were zoned industrial. Other ordinances prohibited apartments, any apartments in white neighborhoods or single family residential neighborhoods. Land use plans often built freeways through Black neighborhoods to break them up and demolish them. And again, unconstitutional since 1917, but in 1936, the Federal Housing Administration's manual explicitly advises that in order to protect the neighborhood from adverse influences, the best artificial means of providing protection from adverse influences is through the medium of appropriate and well-drawn zoning ordinances. And in case you weren't sure what is an appropriate and well-drawn zoning ordinances, the FHA is very clear. If the ordinance has been drawn with little or no real understanding of its purpose, meaning segregation, or a genuine desire to promote an orderly city growth, it will offer little protection. So if zoning is used for what it is intended in order to promote orderly city growth, right, you're using it wrong, because you should be using it, if you understand the real reason, to maintain segregated housing and therefore property values. A second strategy that the FHA endorsed, and which also kind of became prominent and more widely used after the Supreme Court declared race-based zoning unconstitutional. So if you couldn't be sure that your ordinance was going to withstand judicial scrutiny, another technique was to begin inserting private racially restrictive covenants in property deeds, right? And again, so these are promises that a homeowner makes that they will never sell their home to a non-white, and it is binding on any future owner, right? So it runs with the land, it's in the deed, this home can never be sold. And again, this development was initially actually encouraged or approved of by the Supreme Court. So racial zoning ordinances are unconstitutional, but in Corrigan versus Buckley, which was in 1926, the Supreme Court said that racially restrictive covenants are constitutional, right? Because they are private agreements between private parties and there is no state action. And, developers grabbed right onto this and, kind of in their promotional material leaned on the Supreme Court, right? The US Supreme Court has declared that Negroes cannot buy in a restrictive white section, right? Attention, white home buyers, the largest restricted white community in Washington. And in, again, in 1936, the manual, the underwriting manual says specifically, right, recorded deed restrictions to strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances by prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended, right? So expressly, kind of saying deeds should have these restrictions that prohibit the transfer or the occupancy by non-whites. And then some of you may know that the Supreme Court actually reversed its decision. And so in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, the Supreme Court said, it overturned Buckley and actually said that judicial enforcement of race-based covenants is unconstitutional, that the judicial enforcement was the state action. But it really didn't have too much of an impact. So the Supreme Court said they weren't enforceable, but that didn't mean they weren't effective in at least providing kind of a signal to Black home buyers, you're not wanted here. And so developers and communities continued using these restrictive covenants kind of as a signal, as a keep out. And it wasn't until the 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was adopted, and the Fair Housing, for everyone in my property class, we learned this literally like 2 classes ago. The Fair Housing Act prohibits making or printing any type of notice or statement that advertises or publishes a discriminatory preference, and that applies to deed restrictions. And so after the Fair Housing Act, racial covenants could no longer be inserted into deeds. But by that point, I mean, the pattern of residential segregation had been so firmly established and kind of cemented into place that it has persisted right up until today. So where do we go from here, right? So this is kind of how we got here. Where do we go? And so we are fortunate to have with us 3 panelists with incredible experience and expertise in this area to provide us with some guidance. So I went a little bit over my own allotted time, but we'll adjust it to make sure all of the panelists have their allotted time. And I'm just delighted to welcome our first panelist, Professor Martine Hackett. Professor Hackett is a professor of health professions here at Hofstra University. She's an she's an expert in public health issues, including infant and maternal health. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. And the health inequities in communities of color, which have been particularly highlighted by the COVID epidemic, sorry. And Professor Hackett also participated in a groundbreaking 3-year investigation that was conducted by Newsday of housing discrimination on Long Island. And so the investigation found that Black testers were discriminated against 49% of the time. And so she will talk to us a little bit about that study and her participation in it. And Martine, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And I appreciate that background as well. And hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today and for this opportunity to be. It's also a privilege to be with this very esteemed panel. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you guys today about sort of the connections between place, racial residential segregation and health outcomes. And one of the things I just want to start off, sort of to ground us in where we're talking about with, and particularly with this pandemic, is one of the things that we saw is that people were leaving the cities to go to the suburbs, leaving the city to go to the suburbs at the height of the pandemic. We saw that the real estate market started going crazy in suburban areas with, houses going over asking price, and in particular that people were moving to the suburbs for health reasons, right? For space, for the ability to have fresh air. And what I want to suggest is that this is actually a very long tradition in human history. And Dr. Hofstra was talking about zoning and real estate. I would argue that public health actually created zoning originally. The idea of separating human activities and the connection between that and the health of the people and where they live actually goes back centuries. And so the idea that people decided to leave cities for suburban areas for presumably healthier and more productive consequences has a long tradition. But what were people moving towards, right? And which people? So thinking about the idea of COVID-19 and where it presented geographically, we know looking at Nassau County that the cases were actually higher in communities of color. And so right here at 4,259 as of January, that was the number of positive cases in Hempstead, for example. And for reasons, as we mentioned, that have to do with crowding living conditions, among other things, we start to recognize as a communicable disease that just moving to the suburbs, right, doesn't necessarily confer good health and good health outcomes to everyone. And when we look at the differences in COVID-19 death, deaths, again, comparing Nassau and Suffolk County to even New York City, even though the rates in this graph, you see the comparing the COVID-19 death rates for Black residents and white residents, we see that that proportion or that difference or disparity is higher in Nassau and Suffolk County than it was in New York City. And so again, when we start to think about the idea of public health and health outcomes of people who live in the suburbs, we know that it is not equal for all. And it turns out that in addition to a lot of the things that we had mentioned in terms of just on a personal level, in terms of why COVID-19 might be spreading, remember, it's an infectious disease, right? It spreads from droplets from one person to the other. And the more that you are in contact with that virus, the higher the likelihood that you have. But as we sort of, zoom out a little bit, what we start to realize is that racial residential segregation is a key factor in why we see those differences, not just in Nassau County, not just in suburban areas, but across the country. You guys just heard, and I know are familiar with the idea of the residential security maps and the grades, A, B, C, and D, D associated with the red or the redlining. But it turns out when we start to look at that intersection of the places that were redlined or zoned the best, most desirable, again, scaled A to D, in Cook County in Illinois, which contains Chicago and the suburbs of Chicago, we see that the percentage of deaths to Black residents were higher in those communities that were grade D or redlined. And in fact, this is something that in terms of the consequences of redlining, decades later, we are still living with. This was a really great, actually visual story that was done in the New York Times a few months ago, looking at Richmond, Virginia, and how the neighborhoods that were redlined to this day have a higher temperature than the neighborhoods that weren't. And part of this has to do with the number of trees that were planted, the way parks were constructed, the way that the housing and the materials that were used. And the truth is that not only is it, wow, it's hotter in the summer, but we know that heat also has public health consequences. So again, these policies not only are having an effect on locally, but across the country. Getting to our local area, thinking about this idea of racial residential segregation, we know that over the decades, there really hasn't been much improvement, in particular, segregation between white and Black residents. On Long Island, we know that there has been a decrease, but still remains what is considered to be extremely segregated. And as was mentioned, in order to investigate this, because, many people will say, well, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. There are many laws. This is not legal to be able to segregate people by race, ethnicity. And so why does this still matter? Well, the idea of then being able to determine does this difference still exist and what are the consequences, really the only way that you can do it is to test it. And so back in 2019, in November of 2019, this series of stories was published by Newsday called Long Island Divided. And it was as was mentioned, a 3-year investigation that looked into how do you know if real estate is being steered or being influenced based on race, ethnicity. And so the way that this testing worked was to do what's called pair testing. And pair testing means you take two individuals who are theoretically only separated or different based on their race or their ethnicity. And otherwise, they have similar backgrounds, they have similar requests for where to live, they have similar incomes, family makeup, and they go in to the real estate agents asking for those similar things, and then you look to see what are the results. And so this investigation looked at housing in terms of housing purchase, not rentals. And the investigation, as was mentioned, again, took a span over 3 years to be able to go from sending the different testers out and then to analyze the data. And I was one of the testers for a couple of years. And the way that it worked was we wore cameras, sort of hidden cameras, and also which also recorded the video and the audio. And in addition, the information was then sent from the real estate agents back to the Newsday offices. And so in this example that you see up here is sort of comparing me and the, another tester that I was paired with. By the way, I never met any of these other testers, right? We just sort of went in, did what we needed to do, and sort of came back. And so this is an example of when they sent me out to the Hamptons, actually, to look for a house out east, and again, found differences in that the census tracts that I was given were less white than the census tracts that my counterpart was given. And I think that the bigger point is that, we gave the exact same information, right? And how do we know? We have the recordings to show that. And yet we were given different listings. This is not the listing from my study, but from another one. And here's where you can start to see what some of those differences look like, again, on the map of, in this example, Nassau County. And so in this test, the requirements were that the two testers had to say, we want a home within 30 minutes of Garden City, and we're able to pay up to $450,000. And the black tester, when they went in, were given 7 listings. The white tester was given 16 listings. The black testers were given listings in neighborhoods that were 76% white as compared to 83% white for the white listings. And again, you can see this sort of also identified on this map. And again, what we can say is, so what, right? We were able to sort of see what those differences are. People were given this information, but I think one of the things that we recognize with as a consequence of this testing certainly was there were changes in legislation on the state level, real estate policies that were also adjusted. But one of the things I think it also left was sort of a taste sort of a bad taste in people's mouths, right? In terms of this idea of what that means about where we are living on Long Island. So as a result of this 3-year testing process and analysis and investigation, here were the results. And one thing I'll just tell you real quick is that many people said to me, like, why do we even need to do this testing? Like, didn't everybody already know this? And I think to me, like, that isn't so, that's not a great statement, right? The fact that if we already knew this, right, why are we not doing anything about it, right? And so I think that what we saw is certainly a confirmation for many people, and also a recognition that even 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, there are still consequences based on the color of your skin and where you are steered, and where real estate allows you or suggests that you can purchase a home. And, again, thinking about the consequences of this, we recognize that helps to confer a racial wealth gap, right? In terms of home ownership, we know overall home ownership rates are different for white families versus Black families versus Latino families. But we also know that where you live, right, and if you are able to buy a home as a Black resident, you are going to be hit differently depending on the value of that home. And so some of you might be familiar with this concept of the segregation tax, which talks about the idea that when you are equalizing for income and everything else, Black homeowners are still going to receive less money for their homes, especially because they are going to be in a mostly Black neighborhood compared to white homeowners. And so this is something that, again, even though we are recognizing that there is technically, the freedom to live anywhere, we are seeing that this segregation tax is having consequences over the long term. And again, when we start to think about that, right, we start to think about why is that? And how does that perpetuate itself beyond, being steered from one place to another? Well, it perpetuates itself in the school districts. We know in Nassau County that there are over 60 school districts, very local, zoned very locally, right? And so this is a screenshot from an organization that's called greatschools.org. And so you go onto just about any real estate site, and greatschools.org has an ad, and that you can click. And as you're looking, and if let's say I'm moving to Long Island and I have kids, which is again what a lot of reasons why people move to the suburbs, and if I'm trying to decide where it is I want to live, I will look at goodschools.org and I'll say like, wow, those places that are in red or orange are not the places I necessarily want to be able to invest in a home for a good school. And what is it that makes a good school? We also recognize that local taxes are what inform the school, about 50% of school funding. And so a place that has less home value in, for example, a Uniondale or a Hempstead or a Roosevelt, means that there are less money that's being able to be given to those schools. In addition, if there are fewer businesses in those neighborhoods as well, that's also less money for the school districts. And so when we start to see this connection between where people live, we are recognizing that it has longer term consequences. And it also has consequences, as I'll continue to talk about, on your health. And so this is looking at life expectancy at birth. Life expectancy at birth is this idea of a baby born in 2021. How long is it expected to live based on the conditions in which it is born in? And what you see here is that life expectancy at birth for people who are living in neighborhoods like the Hempstead, like in Uniondale, have a lower life expectancy than people who are living in Jericho or Syosset or in the North Shore. And so again, here's where we're coming down to some real consequences of where people live and those health outcomes. And when we think about that relationship between place and health, one of the things that it's important to know is that racial residential segregation is considered to be a fundamental cause of health disparities or differences. And why is that? In part, it has to do with the environment itself. You just heard before about how with the redlining, right? How there were Black residents were more likely to be living in places that had environmental toxins, for example. So the built environment certainly plays a role. Housing hazards. What is the quality of the housing in those different neighborhoods? Environmental hazards, and also just what's available within those communities as well. And so what I want to show you now next is a few maps. This is a map that looks at Nassau County again by census tract. And what you see here is that dark red areas, those dark red areas are percent African American. And again, based on what I've just been showing you, we are not surprised to see this very stark racial residential segregation. The light pink areas are 0 to 20% African American, the darkest red areas 57 to 75%. And you see that it's concentrated in what is sort of locally known as the corridor of color. Here, Hempstead, Uniondale, Roosevelt, Freeport, and also over closer on the west side, more Elmont and Valley Stream. And so this is sort of the most recent layout of what that looks like in terms of percentage of Black residents. But when we start to look at outcomes like high blood pressure, again, in all of these maps, the darker areas represent the highest rates. So we start to see that high blood pressure is also seems to be correlated within those neighborhoods, as are asthma rates seemingly correlated with those neighborhoods, as are diabetes rates seemingly correlated with those neighborhoods, as are stroke rates seemingly correlated with those neighborhoods, as are obesity rates. And so certainly we know that many of these health outcomes are interact with each other. But what I want to suggest is that the idea of, let's say, obesity or diabetes is not that all the people with diabetes decided to move to Hempstead and all the people without diabetes said, let's move to Syosset. We're starting to recognize that there is a relationship between the environment and the health outcomes, which again goes back to the original ideas of zoning and public health, that people recognized decades, centuries ago, that there is a connection between place and health. And looking just a little bit more closely at two adjacent zip codes, Roosevelt, which is majority minority, and Merrick, which is about 90% white, we see that outcomes like infant mortality rate, the death of an infant under 1 year, 13.9 in Roosevelt as compared to 0 in Merrick during the same time period. Childhood asthma emergency department visits, 23 as compared to 2 Roosevelt compared to Merrick. Looking at Uniondale and East Meadow, again, Uniondale majority minority community and versus East Meadow, we see the childhood asthma discharge rates are much, much higher. And looking at that same indicator of asthma and childhood asthma, we see that it's also a similar pattern between Hempstead and Garden City. And so again, when we start to look and understand these connections, we have to say to ourselves, what is really going on? And part of that requires us to get onto the ground level, to actually go into those neighborhoods, to really understand what does that look like for the people who live there. And I also want to add, what are the protective factors for the people who live in a Garden City, right? That they can just wake up, move around, go about their business, and yet are somehow protected in their health as compared to those who live in Hempstead. And I want to suggest that, again, much of that is not necessarily their individual behaviors, but the environment is playing a protective role in their case. And so these are just a few pictures from a project that I did with some teens in Uniondale, looking at some of the things that they have identified as not being supportive of their health, seeing that there are issues with public transportation, issues with excess number of liquor stores, issues with just the way that the community, physically looks, also issues with food availability. And so here's where we start to recognize that this is not a random pattern, right? And that also when we think about the environmental concerns, we also recognize that that is also an issue. And so my last slide is to sort of just open up these thoughts about what can be done about this. And I already saw some people sort of type this into the chat, and I think we'll be able to discuss this later, but really thinking about what can be done. And so we know in Evanston, in Illinois, just within the last week or so, has proposed reparations for Black suburban residents in Evanston, and to be able to say, here are maybe some ways that we can try to retrofit and to be able to make up for what was done in the past. And so I'm going to stop sharing and open this up, or I should say graciously hand this over to Judge Fisher.
Martine, Professor Hackett, thank you. That was so informative. I just want to introduce Professor Fisher, or Judge Fisher, I should say, and then also encourage, some of you have done it, but please submit questions through the chat function. We'll have time for discussion and Q&A, and we'll be happy to get to as many as we can. So it is really my honor to introduce Judge Fern Fisher. Many of you know her. We are unbelievably fortunate to have her teaching at the law school. She serves as a special assistant for social justice initiatives, and she teaches a seminar in landlord-tenant law and a housing practicum where she supervises students who represent unrepresented housing litigants in district court, as well as providing legal assistance to clients through the Northwell Health clinics. Judge Fisher, she began her career as a legal services attorney practicing in Manhattan Housing Court. And in 1989, she was appointed judge of the housing part of the civil court. And then over the next 20 years, she advanced up in the court system. And in 2009, she was appointed Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for New York City courts. And she held that position until 2017. And as I said, we are so fortunate to have her at the law school and also to have her here today to kind of share her thoughts. So Judge Fisher.
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. The topic that I have is evictions and the effect of race on evictions. And let me say that evictions are going to be a very important issue in this country in the next few months. So let me start first with talking a little bit about the national statistics on evictions. So as Martine said, 74% of white households own their own homes. Only 44% of Blacks and 49% of Latinx individuals own their own homes. So there are more renters that are Black and Latinx that would be subject to eviction more than whites. Black tenants are 2 times as likely to be evicted as white tenants. And in 17 of 36 states, Black female renters had double the number of eviction cases filed against them um, in recent past. Nationally, 40% of the homeless population is Black. And most homelessness comes from eviction. Now, when we look at Long Island, it is more difficult to come up with statistics. All right, so eviction stats in Long Island are kept in terms of aggregate numbers of evictions, but neither the court nor the sheriffs who conduct the evictions keep stats based on race, ethnicity, age, gender, or income. But we can look to homeless stats and poverty stats and our anecdotal information to kind of figure out that Black and Latino populations in Long Island are facing more evictions than the white population, percentage-wise. So in Long Island, 26% of Blacks are living below 200% of the poverty. Blacks have the highest unemployment rate in Long Island, 8.7%. Latinx individuals do a bit better with unemployment rates. They fare just slightly worse than white individuals, but they earn the lowest per hour wages of all communities. Unemployment is higher, as I said, in Black communities. And for example, Martine referred to this, in the town of Hempstead, the unemployment rate for Blacks is 54%, and excuse me, and for Latinos, 39%. And so unemployment is concentrated in communities of color. So statistics are also showing that hourly wage amounts are on the decline for Blacks. So what leads to evictions? Income instability. And so based on the statistics that I just gave you, you can see that Black and Latinos face more income instability than individuals who are white. In terms of the homeless population in Long Island, that's a hard stat to find. The best I could find was fairly recently that 56% of the total homeless population is in the Black community, 56%, and in the Hispanic community, about 19%. When you look at the population of Blacks and Latinos in Nassau and Suffolk, the percentages of the individuals that are in homeless state are skewed based on the percentage of the populations that the Black and Hispanic community actually comprise. So income instability leads to eviction. People can't pay their rents, but also lack of affordable housing is a big issue. And, the stats regarding home ownership are lower for Blacks and Latinos in Nassau and Suffolk County. Rents are at an all-time high. Neither Nassau or Suffolk have done a spectacular job in providing affordable housing to anybody that live in the county. One example of malfeasance or just total ineptitude would be the town of Hempstead that had $1.3 million worth of Section 8 funding that was never dispersed to individuals that need Section 8. And unfortunately, the town never really admitted to being culpable for that. And this $1.3 million remained in the coffers, despite the fact that there was a waiting list of people from Hempstead waiting to get Section 8 subsidies. I mean, it's just outrageous in my opinion. Since then, this happened in May of 2019, the administration for the Hempstead funding for Section 8 has been transferred to Nassau County. But just generally, there is very limited affordable housing in Nassau and Suffolk. Public housing, better known as the projects, have waiting lists of years and years. Most towns have closed their waiting lists for Section 8, which means you can't even get on a waiting list to wait for Section 8 benefits. But what exacerbates the problem is that owners frequently are reluctant to accept Section 8 subsidies. So even if you're fortunate enough to get Section 8, there are so many owners that will not accept it. Anecdotally, from sitting in the district court with my students, there were numerous individuals, mostly of color, who would come in and they were being evicted. They had Section 8 status, but they were not able to move from the place they were being evicted from to another or a new Section 8 apartment because they couldn't find an owner to accept the subsidy. So after a time period, those subsidies expire and that person is removed from the Section 8 list, and they never, right now they can never get the subsidy again. We don't have records. There is no data to show how many Section 8 subsidies have expired in Long Island, but I suspect it's numerous. There is really, New York City has a anti-discrimination law based on your source of income, which is not really well enforced. Long Island does not have all those protections, and so landlords get away with, just not accepting these Section 8 benefits. There is some buildings that are dedicated to veterans, seniors, and there are what is called the Section 8 projects, but those openings are very, very few, and the number of units throughout Long Island are extremely limited. It will continue to be a problem into the future. But and as Martine mentioned, discrimination with respect to obtaining housing is not just in the purchase of homes, but also in the rental of homes. But next topic I wanted to really speak about is what is coming soon, and that is a tsunami of evictions. Because of COVID, we expect that the numbers of evictions in this country are going to skyrocket any day now. Now, you've heard about the fact that there's a moratorium on evictions, but the moratorium of evictions is not even throughout the country. There's some states that are going forth with evictions. Texas is one of them, and people are being evicted in great numbers as we speak. Now, in New York, there is a moratorium that is being enforced, but we expect that any day now, a few months, that people will be subject to eviction. And those are the legal evictions. What we don't have is good stats on what we call illegal evictions, where the landlord has not resorted to the courts to evict a tenant. And that is a big problem in terms of not only getting data on it to figure out how many illegal evictions are occurring throughout the country, but an illegal eviction can be much more traumatic than an eviction carried off carried out by a sheriff or a marshal or some government official. So illegal evictions are at an all-time high. I hope at some point we're able to obtain um, statistics on it, but that clearly is a problem and clearly affects mostly Black and Latino tenants. So in terms of what's going on now, renters are experiencing, economic difficulties, more income instability than in the past. And the percentages of renters who are Black, who are suffering from the economic impact of COVID is 57%, Latinx 64%, Asian 51%, and white 47%. So it is spread across races, but as you can see, the higher amounts affect Black and Latino populations. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, if we don't do something, we're going to have extremely serious problems in terms of people living in stable housing. So we need to get on top of education equity, healthcare equity, income stability, and housing stability. So with respect to housing stability, the development of more affordable housing, a more robust Section 8 program throughout the country would be helpful. More public housing, public authority housing would be helpful as well. I strongly urge you to read the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, which tells the story of eviction in Milwaukee, and in which he also proposes a voucher system where all people would get vouchers for housing. He tells some extremely compelling stories about individuals who have been evicted, and makes a extremely good point that people of color in Milwaukee suffer from eviction more than white individuals. So we as a society have choices. Are we going to treat members of our society as human beings and make sure that they have the basic necessities of life? And one of the basic necessities of life is a roof over one's head. And if we don't do something about this very shortly, there will be more and more individuals that do not have a stable roof over their heads, and most of them will be Black and Latino. I pass this on to Professor Nestor.
Well, I'm just going to thank you so much, Judge Fisher. And I'm just going to just briefly introduce Nestor and give some context from where he's coming from. And actually, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome Professor Nestor Davidson, who was one of my very first mentors and has continued to be a mentor and a friend throughout my career. And so I'm particularly glad that he was able to participate today. Professor Davidson is the Albert A. Walsh Chair in Real Estate and Land Use and Property Law at Fordham Law School. And he's also the faculty director of the Urban Law Center at Fordham Law School. He's an expert in property, urban law, affordable housing law, and policy. He's the co-author of a casebook on property law. Professor Davidson earned his AB from Harvard College and then his JD from Columbia Law School. And he clerked for Judge David S. Tatel of the DC Court of Appeals, and then for Justice David H. Souter of the United States Supreme Court. And in addition to teaching, Professor Davidson served as special counsel and principal deputy general counsel at HUD, which is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, under President Obama. And so he comes to this topic and this issue with some insider information on the federal role. And so I am, again, delighted to turn it over to you, Nestor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for inviting me. And I won't thank you for having me go third after two phenomenal presentations, but I'll try not to end on a low note. And thank you as well to the Breslin Center and the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Hofstra Law. This is a really important set of topics you're grappling with, and I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to shift gears and focus a little bit more macroscopically. And Professor Hofstra did a phenomenal job at the outset in laying out really a history that I think is important to understand when we think about the macro patterns and of course the health consequences that come from those macro patterns. So I'll be brief here just to highlight the sort of interrelated nature of a set of federal policies that go back a century or more, structuring the mortgage market in really particular ways, but also subsidies for housing, subsidies for highway construction and trains and transit, and airports, and an incredible range of other policies that set the context in which state and local policymaking around patterns of place take place. But I think states are central and often underappreciated in conversations about segregation, about exclusionary zoning, about many of the things we've been talking about. And I think it's obviously important to focus on local governments, but it's states, whether it's New York State or California or Illinois or Florida or any other state, that sets the rules for boundaries, right? So those maps we've been looking at over the last hour or so, with all these fragmented small local governments throughout Nassau, and we can tell the same story throughout the state, right? Those are all created, empowered, hardened in many ways by state law. And state law has changed on this. It used to be that we had a much more regional approach. We can think about the growth of New York City itself. But really over the last 50 or 60 years, we've had a structure of state law that has really empowered these fragmented small local governments in suburbs around the country. It's a story, obviously, we can tell about Long Island. It's a story you can tell about Westchester, but really you can look at any metro area in the country and tell the same story. And then, of course, obviously, as we've been talking about over the course of the last hour or so, local choices really are critical. And what I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the interplay between all of these levels of governance and what interventions might be available really at every level. So I'm going to focus on one particular policy at the federal level. And just to say that there are no simple answers in all of this. Residential choice is obviously framed by these macro structural questions and these individual choices, individual decisions, right? That's why anti-discrimination and testing and finding ways in which thousands and thousands and thousands of individual transactions and interactions every day shape the choices that people have, absolutely critical. But if we want to think about how we move the needle in terms of some of the larger patterns and how we also shift from equality, which is of course critical, formal equality, to a lens that privileges equity, which is to say awareness of the structures, awareness of the underlying patterns. We have to think beyond just a kind of individual anti-discrimination paradigm, as important as that is. And so the idea that we have to think both in terms of anti-discrimination and larger structural patterns is nothing new. And for those of you who know the Fair Housing Act, you know that in 1968, this was built into the DNA of the Fair Housing Act itself. And in fact, some would argue that the elements of the Fair Housing Act that were meant to target these larger structural patterns were the impetus as much as many of the individual anti-discrimination provisions. If you look at the floor debates, if you look at what the sponsors said, they were cognizant of what the Kerner Commission had talked about. shortly before, which was published shortly before the Fair Housing Act was adopted, right? The idea that we needed to have a vigorous federal response to these large-scale structural patterns of access to opportunity, of segregation, of concentrated poverty. And so there are two provisions of the Fair Housing Act that specifically mandate that the federal government, one targets HUD and its grantees, and the other complements that with a mandate across the federal government to administer, quote, the programs and activities relating to housing and urban development, which of course is an incredibly broad category, in a manner affirmatively to further the policies of the Fair Housing Act. And this affirmatively furthering, or AFFH, mandate in the Fair Housing Act was understood from the beginning to require the federal government and recipients of HUD funding, which turns out to be pretty much every state and local government in the country, to address the structure and the consequences of policy choices that Professor Hofstra laid out, I think, in really remarkable detail. And so this gets enacted in 1969. In 1968, 1969, the HUD secretary, a fellow by the name of George Romney, father of Mitt Romney, current senator and former governor of Michigan, who had lived through riots in Detroit, who had lived through urban unrest in his time as governor, and took this mandate seriously and enacted a policy called open communities. And basically what he said was that the federal government would stop funding communities unless they took seriously their obligation. And this was mostly targeted at the suburbs, their obligation to provide a sufficient range of housing choices and, of course, an infrastructure of anti-discrimination. His test case was a suburb of Detroit called Warren, Michigan. There was a $3 million urban renewal funding grant, and he conditioned that grant on a plan for developing affordable housing. And there was a firestorm of opposition. It went all the way up to the White House. The Nixon administration essentially killed the program. And it has largely remained in the background ever since. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration created a process where grantees would be required to do what's called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And that's sort of looking internally at what might prevent people from being able to live where they want to. What are those patterns? It was almost never enforced. It was rarely taken seriously. HUD never reviewed them. And some local governments did fine analyses of impediments to fair housing choice, but most understood it was a box checking exercise and duly checked the box. The Obama administration, starting really in 2013, in 2009, and for a period of about 7 years, went through a regulatory process to actually create a process around affirmatively furthering fair housing that would at least have the potential to work. And so the model that the Obama administration came up with in this rule was to provide a suite of data tools, a baseline of nationally uniform data around a set of markers, not just integration and segregation, but a range of aspects of opportunity, of access to opportunity around schools and jobs and transit and the like. And then a rigorous step-by-step process in which these jurisdictions could go through and work with the data that HUD provided, plus supplement their own data. It was not just limited to that, their own local knowledge about conditions and history and patterns, and discern what had led to the patterns that the data revealed. And then most importantly, the grantees were going to have been required to propose policy solutions, right? Either on a local basis, or there was a tool for regional cooperation around AFFH. And then those policy proposals would both be screened by HUD at the front end. And then the idea was this was a kind of 4-year planning cycle. And over time, as grantees would resubmit their analyses of fair housing, that was what it was called, AFHs. If you work in Washington, you learn acronym after acronym after acronym. But these AFHs would be reviewed over time, and ideally progress would be made. But if policies were not having the intended effect, then policies would have to change. And there would be a dialogue, but it would be a bottom-up process where HUD would provide knowledge, HUD would provide a framework for analysis, but then local governments, jurisdictions around the country would have to do the hard work of actually asking what would change patterns on the ground. What needs to be changed in zoning? Does a jurisdiction need? Judge Fisher mentioned source of income anti-discrimination, a huge problem, right? Does a local government need to enact a local source of income anti-discrimination provision? A whole host of other questions, right, that this process was meant to discern. And this finally arrived about a year before the end of the Obama administration. There was a first round of jurisdictions that went through it. The early round of these analyses were actually really well done by and large, really rigorous, and we're beginning to move policy. There was a change in administrations. Obviously, as we all know, in 2016, the Trump administration really slowed it down and ultimately, in the heat of the re-election last summer in July, withdrew it, issued an emergency rule and withdrew the Obama era affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, claiming the Trump administration made this an election issue, that the Trump administration had somehow saved the suburbs. And we all understand the racial politics involved in that. And so we now have had another change in administrations, and the Biden-Harris administration and the newly sworn in Secretary of HUD, former Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, have signaled not only that restoring this AFFH process, which barely had the chance to begin to get off the ground before it was stopped in its tracks, not only will they make restoring the process their highest priority, but also improving it. Even though it was a 7-year process of development, everyone recognized at the beginning that there were improvements that could be made over time. And so I think this is really going to engage the early part of the current administration. And I do think it has promise. I think it's plugged in the current administration to a larger conversation that's being driven by the White House about equity, about where these concerns play into everything from environmental policy to transportation policy to just basic economic policy. And HUD, I think, will play an important role in that conversation. And so I remain cautiously optimistic that the policy will be restored, the rule will actually be improved, and we may begin to see a kind of a collaborative process between largely local governments who will be empowered with data, with tools, but also held to a standard that if progress isn't being made, that will eventually have a consequence for federal funding. So let me turn in my last 5 minutes to saying that obviously the federal government is an important player in this. I was asked to say a few words about where federal intervention could make a difference, and I really do believe that it can and that it will. But let me just say a few things about a really, I think, interesting, exciting moment we're also having at the state and in some places at the local level. We are beginning to grapple a lot more vigorously, I think, in many parts of the country with the consequences of exclusionary zoning, with the patterns that have the kinds of implications that we've been talking about in this session. I would say New York's a bit of an outlier on this. Just to reiterate some of the details, just to again ground us in context, right? So the New York metro region, by some measures, at least black-white segregation, is the second most segregated metro region in the country. It's got the second most restrictive overall zoning when you look across the region. Take Long Island, nearly 3 million people, 2.8 million people in Nassau and Suffolk County. That would be one of the largest cities in the country if it were a city aggregated, right? On average, over time, the entirety of Nassau and Suffolk County approves about 3,000 units of housing a year. It doesn't even keep up with job growth. And obviously, the inability to add to density, the inability to add to the housing stock has a direct effect on employment, and leads to obvious economic consequences as well. But we're focused on equity. So what are states other than New York? What are other states doing? So, affirmatively furthering fair housing is a planning mandate, but states haven't waited for the federal government to try to figure out how to incentivize and encourage and facilitate fair housing planning. California has its own version of an affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. Oregon, Washington, Utah, Florida, a number of states have state planning mandates, and they are increasingly focusing on questions of exclusion, questions of race, questions of patterns of segregation. Boston recently passed its own citywide version of affirmatively furthering fair housing in its zoning code, saying that positive affirmative steps have to be taken to overcome patterns of segregation, in unequal access to opportunity, concentrated poverty on the basis of race, and other concerns at the heart of AFFH. A growing number of local governments, beginning in Minneapolis, but moving now to other local governments and to the state level, Oregon and others, are really beginning to rethink the primacy of single-family zoning, banning single-family zoning in some places altogether, at least for new construction. And that's for those of us who've watched zoning and housing and the fair housing conversation for decades, it's a sort of stunning development. Part of it is driven by the rise of a movement that recognizes the link between construction density, building, and these fair housing outcomes. It's called the YIMBY movement, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. It's a play on what you're all probably familiar with, the NIMBY movement, or it's not really so much a movement, but the phenomenon that is true everywhere from the Upper West Side to every suburb in America that people tend to oppose almost all development reflexively. Not in my backyard. And the YIMBY movement says if we're going to solve some of these larger intractable structural problems, we have to take questions of density and zoning and exclusion more seriously. So I think, this doesn't mean that we've necessarily reached an inflection point, but I think there's an accelerating recognition in states around the country and in some local governments that we need to take these patterns much more seriously, and the kind of resistance to development, to transit-oriented development, to sustainable development that has been a hallmark of suburban patterns and some urban patterns. You want to see community resistance try and put an apartment building in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, but I think we're beginning to see a shift. And I think it's one that is worth embracing, and one that I think that we can have some optimism around. That said, I'm going to end in my last minute with just a note of caution that I think is important to recognize when we have this conversation, which is we now have a Supreme Court where there are 5 and possibly 6 votes to take the position that any consideration of race, regardless of whether you are advantaging or remedying historical discrimination, should be subject to strict scrutiny. And the view of what would survive strict scrutiny is fairly narrow. They haven't come for the Fair Housing Act yet. They haven't come for the kinds of race-conscious policies that policies like AFFH would at least require in terms of the analysis. But I fear that a kind of hard-edged, Lochnerized, colorblind 14th Amendment may end up sooner rather than later, and I think this is a court eager to move quickly, may end up as an impediment to a lot of the progress that we're beginning to see. So I will leave it there. I look forward to the questions, the conversation. And again, thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you so much for joining us, and really to each of you, to the entire panel. I just think the wealth of information, and if you've been monitoring the chat at all, you could see that we've gotten lots of questions about lots of really different topics. And so I am, as a moderator, not even quite sure where to start because there are so many of them that seem important. I guess one of the themes that I've been seeing coming up is particularly with regard to record keeping and efficiency. So a number of comments have, asked about whether the federal government can mandate that, local housing authorities keep track of Section 8 housing and how much of it expires. Whether there are other methods of trying to make this more the analysis based on statistics and on evidence. So, I mean, I guess this is primarily initially for Fern, but then, if you can all chime in.
Yeah, I think certainly the federal government could pass regulations that requires that individual housing authorities keep records. And I hope to see that in the future. I think it will tell a story that needs to be told and will be a big wake-up call.
Nestor, do you foresee that actually happening with the federal government?
Yeah.
I think that we have an administration, and I say this, as an outside observer, but someone who's paid close attention, that I think is going to take these questions of equity very, very seriously. And there are a host of really in the weeds kinds of policy conversations that are happening right now. I'll give you one example about how, I think Judge Fisher mentioned Evicted, this phenomenal book, which I commend all of my students and I commend all of you if you haven't read it. One of the policy conversations that Matthew Desmond talks about in that book, and it was one that preceded the book, but he does a very nice job of capturing it, is the idea that we set fair market rents, we set the subsidies for these vouchers at a scale, at a level that is really essentially at the kind of metropolitan region, right? And so what that means is that you have some neighborhoods where the subsidy is actually too generous. And you have many, many neighborhoods where the subsidy doesn't really go far enough and doesn't allow people to use it. And so one of the policies that began to be experimented with in the Obama administration, that the Trump administration then withdrew, lost a lawsuit over it, and I think will come back in further rounds of creative experimentation, is how do you target subsidies? There was a policy called zip code fair market rents, small area fair market rents, to try to get the linkage between the subsidy that HUD provides and the scale of the neighborhood much closer, right? It turns out to be logistically a little challenging to do, but that's the kind of creativity that I think we have to kind of get into the real interstices of the programs. And I think I'm optimistic this is an administration that will do that.
But I also think that we can look at localities to adopt more anti-income discrimination laws and some monitoring by local governments as to which owners, are discriminating based on income, and, put them on some kind of, naughty list or watch list or something like that. And that, in some localities, that's going to be easier to push through than others. And Nassau and Suffolk is going to be a problem.
And look, there are proposals to add source of income to the federal fair housing, and I'm not sure there'll be enough, political will to get to 60 votes in the Senate on that. But actually, it has bipartisan support. I'm not sure it has 10 Republicans who are willing to vote for it, but it has been endorsed by both sides of the aisle, and that would overcome the kind of local parochialism. You could, of course, have a statewide source of income anti-discrimination provision as well that would overcome that. It's like big too.
Well, at least there are 10 votes in their hearts. Whether they will actually vote that way is a different story.
Excellent point.
And I have a follow-up, but I'm going to put it on the back burner. I just want to raise it as an issue, but then I want to get to more of the student questions, which is just, in 2019, New York City passed the Tenant Protection Act, which increases. I see you shaking your head already, Judge Fisher. And so I am kind of curious about what you think the impact that will have on income discrimination, other forms of discrimination, and other forms of just, well, protection against evictions. But like I said, I'm gonna hold off on really making that a question so that I can get to some more student questions, and then maybe we'll have time to come back to it. So another question that I just got is about the Newsday documentary. So for Professor Hackett, the student says that they were disappointed with the way that the real estate agents responded when there was clear evidence of their bias. And rather than kind of acknowledging it and issuing an apology, or I'm going to go take more classes, there was just a lot of just denial and refusal to accept responsibility. And the the role of implicit bias in not even realizing outwardly that there's disparate treatment, but just the implicit bias that, people of color, Black people are not going to be able to afford or are going to not fit into certain communities. I wonder if you just have any comments on that.
Sure. So one thing I would say just from my personal experience in terms of doing this testing is that if you asked me, Martine, how are you treated, by these real estate agents? I would say fine. They were polite. They were very, professional in terms of how they treated me on an individual level. It wasn't until the data were collected and you were able to compare, my counterpart tester, that it really hit me that like, wow, I'm being treated differently, even though I cannot detect it, right? So what I would argue is that we're talking about sort of more systemic level biases that are sort of built in so that you don't even know that you're doing it, right? And, obviously I work in public health as well. And so we see this a lot in medical care as well, in that, we're surrounded by the stereotypes and the stigmas that sort of are associated with the way people look. And for a laugh, if anybody wants to do the implicit association test, right, to be able to take a look and see just how quickly we make those kinds of decisions. And so the point is that even though people might say, like, I was not intending to be able to do this, that's why you need these kinds of tests to be able to actually make that kind of an assessment, to see, like, you might not be intending, but this is the result. And I think that that's sort of the bigger point, is to recognize that we're doing it based on, as we just heard, these policies that have existed for 100 years. And so I think that really is the consequences that we're living with. And to stop taking it sort of personally and to sort of pull it back to that larger system level, I think is what's needed.
And I think that the lack of accountability is just, indicative of the entire lack of accountability in this country for implicit bias and racism and, all the other things that are going on. And it starts with accepting the past and what the past has brought. In terms of what people of color are facing, have faced and are still facing in this country. And of course, it starts with, re-educating this country with respect to the role, that, race and slavery and so forth and so on has brought us. Excuse me, my cat just walked in. Has brought us to this point in time where things are just completely run amok, so this is the time, and it all has impact on health, education, housing, and it's time for us to deal with it and deal with it in real terms.
It's just interesting that, and I may be mistaken about this, but some of what I've read about the history of the Fair Housing Act was that it kind of got the spur that it needed after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I wonder if maybe COVID-19 and some of what 2020 has looked like might create a similar kind of energy or motivation to make changes. So. No?
I don't think so. Not in terms of dealing with race issues. I think because COVID's affected, people who are not of color as well. And, right now the Black community doesn't have anybody to kill off that's going to bring the same kind of impact. That Martin Luther King. I think that leadership has to force the issue. And, leadership comes from, the executive, Biden, Harris, down to Congress, which is, of course, a problem, down to leadership in local, state and local communities. We have to deal with this. We have to deal with it. And education has to deal with it. My daughter teaches in a Nassau County school district, will remain nameless. And their approach to race, and it's a white district, but their approach to race and what they teach is really piss poor, and exacerbates the problem.
Yeah. Okay, so one other question that I got that I thought was very interesting and got me thinking was about one of my students called it chosen segregation, and this idea that certain ethnicities and I guess really immigrant communities tend to kind of congregate in particular neighborhoods, and so the student asked, the culture seemed to remain stronger by being densely packed. Are there benefits to ethnic segregation? And I guess, does it make a difference if it's by choice or not by choice? I see Professor Falami just wrote intersectionality, so I guess that she is also excited by this topic. And so I want to open it up, and also Professor Falami, if you're on and want to unmute yourself, I'm welcome, for you to contribute to this discussion. But I'm not putting you on the spot. So in the meantime,
Instinct to cold call is pretty brutal.
I know, right?
I mean, I would just say, that ethnic enclaves have obviously been a way that, immigrants have come to a country like the United States, where they come to live, places people who can speak their language, help them with jobs, help them with housing. We know that this is something that has certainly worked in many communities and certainly does exist still. I mean, I live in Uniondale, and I can see, how the people of different ethnic backgrounds will then bring in other people to then purchase a home, and so on. But I think the key is the idea of choice, right? And so what level is this something where, you are choosing to be able to do this? And then at what level is this something that you're being prevented from being able to do? So I would think that that's, one aspect to it. And then the other aspect, of course, is just in terms of the values of the homes, right? And so that then does not confer that level of, assets in that same way for some communities, right? Right. So I saw before in that chat, the Persian American community, or the Portuguese community, right? Yes. In Mineola, I would argue that ethnic enclave is just going to have a different level of value of the homes there than a Salvadoran community in, Hempstead, for example.
Right. I actually think that kind of gets to the point about, sort of the good immigrant communities and the bad immigrant communities, and how some immigrant communities start off concentrated, and that becomes a stepping block towards mainstreaming and moving into, white neighborhoods, and other ethnic communities remain marginalized and do not integrate. And so second and third and fourth generations are still kind of, stuck in those neighborhoods.
So can you hear me, Professor Falami?
Yes. Laura, can you spotlight Professor Falami? There you are.
So I've been enjoying the exchange with the students in the chat boxes. And so this is quite a heated topic in terms of the question Megan asked about chosen segregation, in the sense of, we've talked about it in my critical legal theory class, implicit or undergirding this conversation of integration is an adoption, arguably an adoption that being around whiteness is better, right? That is what's going to get you access to opportunities and blah, blah, blah. What can be taken from Megan's suggestion is that why not invest resources, time, arguments towards, if you want to segregate, to Professor Hackett's point, the choice of segregation. If you have Black communities, people who are forcefully separated, fight for resources that are equal of given to others, right? And so if the position is that there's anti-Black bias or Black people, nobody wants to live next to them, what have you, or rather than fighting to become part of the majority or live in white enclaves where there are white resources, why not spend time, opportunity, energy for equal resources in Black communities, right? And so you have segregated communities, and in essence is what I'm saying. So, or suggesting, and how I take Megan's point, that Black folks can take relief, if you will, living among their own. And there's a history of that. If so, those of you who are aware of Tulsa and similar communities in Charlotte and blah, blah, blah. So I wonder, I want to advance that question to the panel. And I'm so great that, you know, that Megan raised it, right? And so in terms of limited resources, energy, this fight's been fighting since Brown and thereafter, and all of the, even going further, Professor Hofstra, to your point, zoning restrictions, blah, blah, blah. Why not say, you know, accept the fact that it's cultural or implicit bias, whatever you want to call it. Whites may not want to live next to Blacks because of anti-Black bias or what have you. Fine. Resources dedicated towards garbage pickup, stores in Black communities, blah, 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 which in some ways might reverse bias, because once you elevate the socioeconomic status of Blacks in their community, et cetera, maybe the perceptions will be different. Folks say that is what happened with Obama, Michelle Obama. Like, you see this shining example of Blackness, if you will. So reshaping the Black community and with resources, would that be a better approach, if you will, is the question.
Yeah, anyone on the panel want to respond?
Or any of my critical legal theory, because we were going after it in class.
Just one quick thing I would say is that in public health, this definitely is this idea of a community building or asset-based approach is certainly something that people are looking at in terms of how do you, if where you live affects your health, then the solution is not to have everybody move. The solution is how do you then improve those communities so that they have better access to food services, for example. But I think one of the things that I'm sure we all know is that there also is this idea of a zero-sum game, right? Whereas if you are giving these resources to one group, it's removing resources from another group. And so I think that certainly, and then you have local control on top of that, right? Which a place, so just to use again, Nassau County as an example, you have Roosevelt, which is a majority minority community, which is a hamlet, which, does not have any, power really beyond the county, beyond the town and the county level. And so that really kind of hampers or limits what one can do unless it sort of comes from the top down. And so I would say, yes, absolutely, that has been shown to be able to build those assets within those community, ends up having better, certainly, health outcomes. But I think that, the challenge is in how those resources are distributed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Nestor and I definitely share an interest on local government boundaries and the powers that come with it. And I often use the example in my classes of Uniondale, where we are at Hofstra, is an unincorporated, it's just an unincorporated part of the town of Hempstead. And so it doesn't have its own zoning authority, and it doesn't have its ability to enact certain policies that might help it, improve conditions. So I want to throw out one. We're almost out of time, and I know we have a hard stop at 2. But I guess I just want to throw out the very recent decision in a Chicago neighborhood to award reparations and to try to give some reparations to Blacks who may have been discriminated against during that 50, 60-year period where the federal government was actively promoting it. I'm curious, as for all of you, what you think is the potential of that, what it would remedy, what it would not remedy, and sort of advice for federal, state, and local governments. I'll open up to anyone who wants to.
I mean, I think it makes people feel good, but I don't think it remedies, and it doesn't move us forward to change. And how do we change in the future? So you throw some dollars on it, and it's not a whole lot of money. That's not going to move us forward to change. And I was, when you talk about consensual segregation and, throwing resources at Black communities, Latino communities, whatever communities that need the resources. My only concern is that, I live in an affluent community now, and I have faced, racism. People have even known I was a professional and I still had a problem with race. So, the question is, if we segregate, we might live better, but are we still going to get equity in terms of how we're treated, how we're viewed, and, who we can associate our employment? So, I think people should want to live where they want to live, obviously, but I think reparations, we're due, and we should get reparations, African American communities, the Japanese community, whatever, but it does not change the fundamental problem of race in this country.
I think one of the things it does force a conversation, and I think that garners attention, right, and debate, even though the debate might be about like how do you decide how much, all of this. And I think that that's sort of what is needed. We need to sort of engage in that level of discourse so that there is at least you're having this discussion. Why reparations? For whom? Based on what? Again, going back to what was said earlier about understanding what that history is and how that is, having repercussions today. So at minimum, I would say that it would be useful in sort of supercharging the discourse so that it allows us to sort of start thinking in this way of how those structural issues are, playing out in people's lives today.
So I just want to ask if anyone, any of the panelists has any kind of final thoughts or suggestions for the future, and maybe leave us with a note of optimism.
I'll just say, and then unfortunately I have to go because I have to teach it too. I apologize. Conversations like this and the fact that we were having this conversation as a nation, as painful as recent years have been, is progress. I've been involved in housing policy and fair housing for many, many years, and I think the kind of prominence of the conversation, the breadth of the conversation, hasn't changed anything yet, right? Judge Fisher is right. I think we have to accelerate change, but I think having that conversation in the way that we are is the first step, and that brings me a little bit of optimism. And so, thank you for facilitating it, and I apologize that I have to go.
Thank you. Thank you I know you came from a class and you're going to a class. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah. Kara, I actually have a 2:00 Zoom too, and I just want to say that I agree with Nestor, is that educating through whatever ways that we can do it is the answer. And just to give you a quick answer, the Housing Stability Act that you mentioned,
yes,
they missed the boat on lots of issues. There are good parts of it, but it's certainly not going to address the race issues, and certainly doesn't also address all the inequities that tenants face as well.
Thank you, Judge Fisher. And Professor Hackett, do you want to?
I would just end by saying I have hope in this generation of students, and that is the thing that really does kind of keep me personally going, is to recognize that there are people who are who will sit around and listen to a conversation like this for a couple of hours, right? People who are taking these issues seriously, who are engaged, who are want to be informed, and who are willing to fight. And so that's what I think is sort of the optimism or hope that I have.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. This was such an interesting conversation, and we got into so many interesting nuances and details. And I hope that even, here at Hofstra and at the Breslin Center, we can keep this conversation going and continue to have these discussions and panels. So with that, thank you all for attending. And I'm going to end the meeting now. Bye, everybody.